Welcome, sports fans, to our discussion here on the age of exploration and how Europe starts to connect with the world and with the empires of Asia that we've been talking about. So, as you enjoy this awesome video, be sure to take notes and hopefully, I'll be able to remind you to write down certain things. So, here we go. Okay, so here it is, 1450, and this is a map here by a Catholic priest. And so this is what Europe knows about the world. So if you look at it for a second, you can see what areas of the world they know well, what areas of the world they have no idea but have a vague idea about. And then of course you'll notice two continents are entirely missing. So here, look how well they know Europe here and the Mediterranean. So they have this idea here. But then when we get around Africa and into Asia, right, that's when they kind of lose their sense of perspective. So I think this map is curious so we can see what the Europeans knew on the eve of the age of exploration. So why now? Why is it in the late 14, early 1500s that Europeans are ready to explore? So you recall perhaps from last year the Renaissance, right? This reawakening of culture. Europeans begin to question what they know, what they believe, and are willing to rethink their concept of the world. The spirit of adventure. They have had for a long time now the stories from, I'll just pretend this is Marco Polo, right? Maybe you talked about him last year, this traveler from the Middle Ages who went all the way to China, and he comes back with these stories. So by the time Christopher Columbus is growing up, he had his own copy of Marco Polo's travels. And so they were fascinated about the unknown and the treasures they assumed were there. So the spirit of adventure. And finally, Europeans had new technology that allowed them to actually set sail onto the ocean. Okay, so that's the kind of the spirit of the times, but what we've got to, of course, be practical. What is motivating the Europeans to explore? And perhaps I'll give you a second to ponder my pictures here to see if you can guess what is motivating them. But first, of course, is personal glory. You got some Super Bowl rings, championships, my favorite, Roger Federer. So personal glory, right? They want to become famous. They want to become wealthy. I mean, of course, we still talk about Columbus and others. The second one, I'm sure, they want to spread Christianity. In this case, we're going to talk about Catholicism. And we'll talk about some changes in Western Christianity soon. And part of that was to build up the Catholic Church. And I bet you can guess what the number one reason is, of course, and that is money, right? So Italian and Muslim traders have controlled the market, all the trading that's coming in from the East. Italians would put a high tax on it, to make a good profit and or ratchet up the prices when they sold it to other Europeans. So our Spanish, our Portuguese, the English, they're kind of like, we want a piece of this for ourselves. So they're going to start to spread out into the ocean, right, to find their own routes to the east. So, in case you forget what these three motivations are, they are often referred to as the three G's: God, glory, and gold. Okay, so let's talk about the technology that the Europeans had, which they got, of course, from their neighbors to the east. The first is the astrolabe. This complicated machine here allows them to chart the stars in a sense. And so they would record where they are in the night sky and other measurements that involves math. I'm above my pay grade. And so then they're able to sail away from the coast, right? Up until this time, they have to stay within sight of land. So this allows them to go out and then record the path they took for people to come behind them. Of course, the compass. This is a picture of a compass from the 1500s, and they got from the Chinese, Did I say the astrolabe came from the Arabs? And so you can see the compass, right, floated in this a bucket of water. And so these two things, of course, I don't need to tell you how extraordinary they are and how it helped the Europeans, again, to go out away from the sight of land. And then the last development here are these caravels, these ships that were big enough to set sail in the ocean, but could ride shallowly in the water that they could go up big rivers. So this was the ship that allowed them to cross the oceans, plus, if I may add, triangular sails, right? The Vikings and the Greeks had these square sails, but they're dependent on the wind. So if the wind dies down, they're kind of, as they say, dead in the water. So these triangular sails, right, allowed the boats to kind of zigzag and use the wind to their advantage. So did you write all of this down? Okay, so what we'll be talking about over the next week or two is kind of the series of who goes when. So in the 1500s, we have our friend the Portuguese and the Spanish. The Portuguese will be the first to hit the ocean, and by the 1600s, England, Netherlands, and the French, they will be ready. And so, right, in case you forgot, the Netherlands, tiny country here, France, England, right, they will then set sail as well. Okay, so we're going to start talking about how Europeans established trading empires and then eventually colonial empires. And we'll look at kind of what's the difference of these two. So right now we're just going to talk about trading empires. So, as I said, the Portuguese are the first to hit the ocean, right? You're a tiny country, you certainly don't have the manpower to cross over land, so they might as well take to the sea. And we owe it all to this man, Prince Henry the Navigator, who is a prince, right? He's the son of the King of Portugal, but he's not really a navigator. He never actually leads Portugal. But he's sort of the movie producer, right? He brings everybody together, gets the smartest people in the room, gets all the technology, sponsors people, and they, under his guidance, to set sail. So the Portuguese, it's important to know, they're the ones that finally broke the Italian Muslim domination of trade. They will establish trading ports in India and Indonesia. And remember, these are the goals for the Europeans, all the rich spice trade. And so because they were so successful, they inspired their rivals to challenge all of these posts. So all these green dots are the territories that Portugal established. So the two big explorers here, Bartolomeu Diaz, so notice the color coding here. I know you're impressed I drew this arrow. He's the first one to round the tip of Africa. So they know the earth is round, right? So that's why they're setting sail. They have no idea this is here. So they kind of have the sense of Africa, but they don't know how big it is. So once Diaz does this, he comes back, tells everyone, and then Vasco da Gama, another name we should know, he then sets sails, follows Diaz's path, and he's the first European to make it to India. And because they're the first, they're able to set up all these ports, right, these posts, and they become very wealthy. So of course, you know how it is. Their neighbor, Spain, is like, wait, what? We can't let you guys get all of this. So we'll talk more about Columbus and the Spanish Empire later, but his travels intensify the rivalry. So he thinks, okay, well, if the Portuguese are going here, I know the earth is round. I bet if I set sail here, I'll reach India. You know, surprise. There's some continents there. So the rivalry becomes so intense between these two Catholic countries that they look to the Pope, Alexander VI. He has to step in and he divides the world between the two powers. And this is the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. There you go. So here's the treaty line. And Spain gets all of this, Portugal gets all of this. Notice they don't care what anyone else seems to think about this, any other Europeans or the people in those countries. So in case you're wondering, half the world belongs to Portugal, half belongs to Spain. Okay, so the Portuguese then dominate for 100 years or so, but by the 1600s, the Netherlands have reached some prominence. They've were once ruled by Spain. They get rid of those guys. And by 1600, they are, this tiny little country right there, has the largest fleet in the world. They will then beat out the Portuguese here, the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, and Indonesia, what is state Indonesia, and they become extremely wealthy. And maybe we'll connect that to the Renaissance, right? The Northern Renaissance. It has quite a huge following in the Netherlands for this reason. So here's their Cape. They establish trading post here, and then, fun fact, they will control Indonesia until World War II. So 300 years they control this area. They also, of course, and you will study more about this next year, come into North America, right? But by 1664, as you probably know, they will be driven out by the British. So we've got Portugal, right, number one. Spain starts to rival them, but then by the 1600s, 100 years later, the Dutch are able to defeat them. The French also get into this game. And here's a map here of their territories in the 1700s. They're in New York, French-speaking Canada, and by 1673 they began exploring the area around the Mississippi River. But the French aren't really colonialists, colonists, I guess I should say. They don't send droves of French people to take over, right? They were mostly fur traders and bringing it back to France to sell. Their great explorer is Jacques Cartier. And because of that, by 1763, the British start to make a claim, and they fight this war that is known in the United States as the French and Indian War, right? The British versus the French and the Indian. But in Europe, it's part of a larger conflict called the 7 Years' War. And the French lose a lot of territory, right, to the British. And you'll talk a lot about this because it's actually a huge turning point between these guys and Great Britain. I'm sure you know what happens soon after that. Okay, so the trading companies then. We'll talk more about Great Britain later, but something that is important is these are extremely risky and expensive ventures. So how would private citizens, if they're not sponsored by royal governments, gather up the money to go out and on these trading companies? So something was formed here, and this is a thing we should know, a term we should know, the joint stock companies. And these are like modern corporations today, right? People buy shares or stocks into a trading company. So it's handy, right? You share the risk, but you also can share the reward. So if the ship goes down, which frankly they often did, whatever your investment was, that's how much you lose. But you could then become extremely wealthy if they were successful. So the two most powerful trading companies are the British East India Company, boom, and the Dutch East India Company. And these companies were like little governments, right? Amazing. They could mint money, they could make treaties with foreign power, and they would even raise their own armies to fight their Portuguese rivals. They would fight India, the Mughals, for territory. And so with the this is the company we'll need to know because we'll talk about them a lot soon. But they will be in and operate almost as if they were a government entity alone in India for probably 100 years. And so this is how not only did people become extremely wealthy, but this money then also came in to make Europe wealthy. And as you will learn, and probably already know, wealth equals power. And so that's it for today. Stay tuned for next time when we look at the rise of these empires. So enjoy.